Hi, I tell very exciting and horrifying stories to everyone. I suggest you subscribe because I post such stories every day. The Widow's Tower. Part 1. The Arrival. Blackthorn Manor was a vast estate, surrounded by the barren moors that stretched endlessly under a perpetually gray sky. Isabel Hawthorne arrived at its threshold on a late October afternoon, her carriage jostling over the uneven, frostbitten ground. As the driver slowed the horses, she leaned out to study the towering edifice before her. The manor seemed to loom over the land like a predatory beast, its jagged spires piercing the sky. Her journey had been long, driven by an almost obsessive compulsion to uncover the story of Lady Eleanor Blackthorne, the widow who had vanished into obscurity. Isabel's colleagues at the university had scoffed at her interest in what they deemed mere folklore. But Isabel's instincts told her there was more to the story than the fragmented rumors suggested. The manor's caretaker, Mr. Garrow, greeted her at the door. His face was pale, his thin lips set in a grim line. "You've made a mistake coming here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No good has ever come of stirring the past in this place." But Isabel would not be swayed. "History must be preserved," she replied, brushing past him into the entry hall. Inside, the air was damp and cold. The once grand interior was now a shadow of its former glory. Chandeliers hung by rusting chains, their crystals clouded with grime. Portraits of somber ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow Isabel's every step. At the center of it all was the widow's tower, its spiral staircase visible through a heavy iron door. Isabel felt an inexplicable chill when she glanced at it, as though the stones themselves exhaled despair. That night, as she prepared for bed, the silence was oppressive. The wind outside battered against the windows, carrying with it faint whispers that she couldn't quite decipher. Though Isabel was accustomed to solitude, something about this place made her feel profoundly unwelcome. Part 2. The Secrets of Blackthorn Manor. The next day, Isabel began her work. She combed through the manor's decaying library, unearthing fragments of letters, journals, and ledger books. Each page revealed glimpses of Lady Eleanor's life. She had been the belle of London society, a woman whose beauty was rivaled only by her intellect. Her marriage to Lord Edgar Blackthorne was a celebrated union, but tragedy struck just 1 year later when Edgar succumbed to a mysterious illness. Left alone in a sprawling manor, Eleanor retreated into the tower. Local villagers reported seeing her at its window, speaking to shadows that no one else could see. One account described eerie lights flickering in the tower, and another claimed to hear disembodied laughter late into the night. Over time, the widow ceased appearing altogether, and the manor fell into disrepair. Among the records, Isabel found something curious, an unsigned letter addressed to Eleanor. It spoke of an ancient relic hidden within the tower, something that could grant her what she desired most. The handwriting was jagged, almost frenzied, and the final words sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. "The price will be your own." Part 3. The First Night. That evening, Isabel felt a growing unease. The tower dominated her thoughts, its dark silhouette visible through her bedroom window. She couldn't help but feel watched, as though unseen eyes were tracking her movements. She was jolted awake in the dead of night by the sound of faint, melodic music. It was a harpsichord, playing a tune so hauntingly beautiful it made her heart ache. At first, she thought it was a dream, But the music grew louder, beckoning her. Lantern in hand, she ventured into the dark corridors. The manor seemed alive, the walls groaning as though they breathed. The music led her to the base of the widow's tower, the iron door ajar. A gust of icy wind spilled out, extinguishing her lantern. But the music persisted, luring her upward despite the terror clawing at her chest. The staircase spiraled endlessly, its steps uneven and slick. The higher she climbed, the colder it became, until her breath formed clouds in the air. The music stopped abruptly, leaving her in a suffocating silence. Then came the voice, a whisper so close it could have been right beside her ear. "You shouldn't be here." Isabel turned, but there was no one there. A cold, unseen hand brushed against her arm, and she fled, nearly tumbling down the stairs in her panic. Part 4. The Diary. The next morning, Isabel confronted Mr. Garrow. "What is the tower? What happened to Lady Eleanor?" The old man's face hardened. "That tower has stood longer than the manor itself. It's older than the Blackthorn name. Whatever Eleanor found there, it wasn't her husband, and it wasn't human." In the library, Isabel uncovered a diary bound in cracked leather, hidden behind a false panel in a bookshelf. It belonged to Eleanor. The entries were erratic, descending into madness with each page. Eleanor wrote of a voice that promised her reunion with Edgar, a voice that spoke to her only in the tower. She described rituals performed by moonlight, sacrifices of blood, and glimpses of a shadowy figure wearing Edgar's face. "He smiles at me," one entry read, "but his eyes, they are not his eyes. They see too much." The final entry was scrawled so frantically the ink had torn through the page. "I cannot escape. It will take me as it took him. The tower demands its price." Part 5. The Haunting. That night, the manor became a nightmare. Doors slammed on their own, and the sound of Eleanor's laughter echoed through the halls. Isabel tried to barricade herself in her room, but the music began again, louder and more frantic than before. A voice spoke through the walls. "Come to me." Compelled by a force she couldn't resist, Isabel found herself at the base of the tower once more. This time, the iron door opened for her without a sound. She climbed the stairs, her lantern flickering violently. At the top, the chamber was bathed in an unnatural glow. Eleanor was there, or what remained of her. The specter's once beautiful face was twisted, her eyes bottomless voids that pulled at Isabel's soul. "You should not have come," Eleanor said, her voice layered with grief and malice. "The tower sees you now." Isabel demanded to know the truth. "What is this place? What does it want?" Eleanor's form flickered like a dying flame. "It is a prison for something ancient, something that feeds on our desires and turns them against us. It gave me Edgar's face, but it was never him." The room began to shake, the walls groaning as though alive. A deep, guttural roar filled the air, and Isabel felt an invisible force pulling her toward the center of the room. Part 6. The Final Sacrifice. In desperation, Isabel held up the diary. "This is your story. You're not bound to this place. Break free." Eleanor hesitated, her form wavering. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached for the diary. The moment her spectral fingers touched it, a blinding light erupted from the pages. The tower screamed, a sound so deafening it felt as though the very earth was splitting apart. Isabel awoke outside the manor, the first rays of dawn warming her face. She turned to see the widow's tower reduced to rubble. The curse was broken. Epilogue: Isabel returned to London, but she was forever changed. The shadows seemed darker and the nights longer. On occasion, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the faint strains of a harpsichord and the whispers of a voice that promised to reunite her with what she had lost, if only she were willing to pay the price. Story 2: The Choir of Hollow Hill. Part 1: A Town with No Song. In the mist-shrouded countryside of southern Wales lay a small, forgotten village called Aberfane. Nestled in the shadow of Hollow Hill, the town was known not for its beauty, but for its silence. No birds sang in Aberfane, no music echoed through its streets, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath as it passed through. Travelers avoided the place, and the villagers themselves lived as though under an unspoken curse. It was this silence that lured Abigail Hartley, a composer and music historian seeking inspiration for her next work. For years, she had heard rumors of Aberfane's unnatural quiet and the ancient church perched atop Hollow Hill. Legends claimed that the church housed a choir that could summon angels or demons with their voices. Abigail, eager to revive her faltering career, was drawn to the idea of uncovering forgotten melodies. When she arrived on a dreary autumn evening, the town felt lifeless. The streets were empty, the windows shuttered. Even the air seemed thick, like it resisted the sound of her boots on the cobblestones. The only movement came from an old woman sweeping her porch. Abigail approached her, eager for directions to the church. The woman looked up, her face ashen. "You've no business on the hill," she muttered. "Not if you value your soul." Undeterred, Abigail pressed for details. "What happened to the choir?" she asked. "Why does no one sing here?" The woman's hands trembled as she pointed toward the hill. "It wasn't meant for human voices. They sang, and now they're part of it. Go back where you came from, girl. Let the hill keep its secrets." But Abigail's curiosity was insatiable. That night, as the moon hung low in the sky, she began her ascent. Part 2: The Church on the Hill. The path to Hollow Hill was overgrown, the branches of ancient trees clawing at Abigail's coat as she climbed. The hill seemed to breathe beneath her feet, the ground soft and spongy as though it were alive. At the summit stood the church, a crumbling relic of stone and ivy, its spire crooked and broken. Inside, the air was suffocatingly cold. Abigail's lantern cast long shadows on the walls, revealing faded frescoes of angels and demons locked in eternal struggle. At the far end of the nave stood the choir stalls, their dark wood polished smooth by centuries of use. As she approached, she felt a strange vibration in the air, like the faintest hum of a tuning fork. Her hand brushed one of the seats, and the hum grew louder, resolving into a low, mournful note. Startled, she stepped back, but the sound continued. It wasn't coming from the church. It was coming from the hill itself. The earth seemed to resonate with a chorus of voices, their harmony both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Abigail sat in one of the stalls, overcome by the haunting melody. Her hand found a small, carved inscription on the armrest. It read, "To sing is to surrender. To silence is to survive." Part 3: The Choir's Song. The next day, Abigail returned to the village, determined to learn more. She sought out the oldest resident, a bedridden man named Ewan Price, who had lived in Aberfane for nearly a century. His hollow eyes betrayed a lifetime of fear. The choir, he rasped, was once the pride of Aberfane. Their voices could bring tears to the hardest hearts. But they wanted more. They sought perfection, divine harmony. So they sang on the hill, where the veil between worlds is thin. Ewan's voice trembled. They awakened something ancient, something that doesn't belong in this world. It listened to their song, and when they stopped, it sang back. What happened to them? Abigail asked. They're still singing, he said, his voice cracking. Their bodies are gone, but their voices, they're bound to the hill. They can't stop, not ever. And neither will you, if you stay. Part 4. The Forbidden Hymn. That night, Abigail couldn't resist returning to the church. She brought her notebook and a portable recording device, determined to capture the strange melody for her composition. The moment she entered the nave, the air grew heavy, the vibrations stronger than before. She sat in the choir stall again, placing her recorder on the stone floor. As she did, the humming deepened, forming a recognizable tune. It was a hymn, ancient and sorrowful, sung by voices too perfect to be human. Abigail transcribed feverishly, her pen moving as though guided by an unseen hand. But as the song unfolded, a terrible realization gripped her. The melody was not merely music, it was a language. The voices weren't singing to her, they were calling her. Suddenly, the recorder crackled, and a voice whispered through the static, "Join us." The shadows in the church grew darker, pooling like liquid around her feet. The hymn grew louder, the voices urgent, pleading. Abigail's own voice began to hum, unbidden, matching their tune perfectly. She clamped a hand over her mouth, but the sound continued, spilling from her throat as though her body were no longer her own. Part 5. Bound to the hill. Panicking, Abigail fled the church, her recorder clutched tightly in her hand. She stumbled down the hill, her breath hitching with sobs. But even as she reached the village, the music followed her. It was in her ears, her bones, her very soul. The villagers saw her and turned away, their faces pale. "It's too late for her," one of them murmured. "She's heard the hymn." Desperate, Abigail smashed the recorder, hoping to break the song's hold. But the voices remained, their melody growing louder and more complex. She realized with horror that the song was alive, weaving itself into her mind. By dawn, she could resist no longer. Her feet carried her back to the church, her voice humming in perfect harmony with the hymn. She climbed the stairs to the choir stalls, her hands trembling as she took her place among the unseen singers. As she sat, the shadows around her coalesced into forms, vague outlines of the choir that had once been flesh and blood. Their faces were featureless, their bodies translucent. Abigail felt her own body fading, her voice merging with theirs. Her last coherent thought was of the inscription on the armrest. To sing is to surrender. Part 6. The Eternal Chorus. Abigail's disappearance was noted only in passing. The villagers of Aberfane knew better than to look for her. Over time, her name faded into obscurity, another victim of the hill's cursed song. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, travelers passing through the valley could hear a faint melody rising from the summit of Hollow Hill. It was achingly beautiful, a hymn that seemed to call out to anyone who would listen. Few could resist its pull. and those who followed the song were never seen again. Story 3: The Watcher in the Glass. Part 1: The Mirror House. Deep in the heart of the Black Forest stood a mansion unlike any other. A sprawling estate built entirely of blackened stone and studded with hundreds of mirrors. The locals called it Spiegelheim, the House of Mirrors. Once the pride of a reclusive aristocrat, Baron Victor von Kraus, it had stood abandoned for decades, left to decay under the weight of its sinister reputation. The mirrors were said to be cursed, each one holding the reflection of something far darker than the person who looked into it. Stories abounded of those who entered the house never returning, or worse, emerging hollow-eyed, whispering of a watcher who dwelled within the glass. This was precisely why Clara Meanhart, a scholar of the occult, found herself standing before its imposing gates on a moonless night. Her breath fogged in the frigid air as she gazed up at the towering mansion. For years, she had sought proof of the supernatural, and Spiegelheim promised more than mere proof. It promised understanding. Despite the warnings of the villagers, Clara pushed the gates open and stepped inside. Part 2: A House of Reflections. The mansion's interior was suffused with a strange, ambient glow, though no candles burned and no moonlight entered. Every wall, every ceiling, and every hallway was lined with mirrors of varying sizes and shapes. Some were cracked, their surfaces tarnished with age. Others gleamed as though freshly polished. As Clara moved deeper into the house, she noticed something peculiar. Her reflection lagged behind her movements. If she turned her head, the mirrored version of herself would linger for a fraction of a second before following suit. She attributed it to fatigue, an illusion caused by her tired eyes. But the unease lingered. In the main hall, she found an enormous mirror framed in gilded iron, nearly 20 feet tall. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, as though alive. As Clara approached, she noticed faint shapes swirling within the glass, like shadows beneath water. Her pulse quickened. This was no ordinary mirror. It was a portal, a window into something else. The mirror seemed to sense her presence, and the shadows began to coalesce into a figure. Clara froze as a pale, featureless face pressed against the other side of the glass. It tilted its head, as if studying her, then raised a hand to the surface. She felt an almost magnetic pull, an urge to place her hand against the glass in return. But before she could, a voice echoed through the hall, low and gravelly. "You must not touch it." Clara spun around to see an elderly man standing in the doorway. His clothes were moth-eaten, his face gaunt. "The Watcher sees you now," he said, his tone grim. "You've invited it in." Part 3: The Watcher. The man introduced himself as Wilhelm, the last caretaker of Spiegelheim. He told Clara of the house's dark history, how Baron von Kraus had become obsessed with mirrors, believing they were not mere reflections, but gateways to other dimensions. Over decades, he collected hundreds of them, conducting strange rituals to awaken the glass. Eventually, the Baron succeeded. The mirrors began to move on their own, showing things that did not belong to this world, things that watched him. The Baron called the entity the Watcher, a being of infinite patience and hunger that dwelled within the mirrors. It had no form of its own, but could take the shape of those who gazed into the glass, wearing their faces like masks. The Baron disappeared, Wilhelm said, his eyes haunted. But the Watcher remained. It waits, feeding on those foolish enough to enter. Clara, ever skeptical, dismissed his warnings as superstition. But Wilhelm's final words chilled her. It wants you to look. The more you see it, the more it sees you. Part 4. A Face in the Glass. That night, Clara stayed in one of the mansion's bedrooms, unable to resist the lure of its mystery. The room was modest but eerie, with a single oval mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed. Though she tried to ignore it, her eyes kept drifting toward the glass. As the hours passed, she began to notice small anomalies. Her reflection blinked when she didn't. Its lips curved into a faint smile when hers remained still. A bead of sweat rolled down Clara's temple as the reflection leaned forward, pressing its hand against the inside of the mirror. It mouthed a single word, "Come." Panicking, Clara covered the mirror with a sheet and tried to sleep. But the house would not let her rest. She was plagued by nightmares of a dark, infinite void filled with countless eyes, all staring at her. In one dream, she stood in front of the gilded mirror in the main hall, watching as her reflection stepped out of the glass and took her place. When she woke, the sheet covering the mirror was gone. Part 5. The Descent. Determined to confront the truth, Clara ventured to the main hall the following evening. The gilded mirror loomed before her, its surface rippling like liquid. She set up her camera, hoping to capture proof of the watcher, and then stepped closer. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice trembling. The mirror obeyed. Shadows swirled, and the pale face reappeared. But this time it wasn't featureless. It wore her face. Clara's reflection stared back at her, its expression blank, but its eyes filled with malice. It raised a hand, and she felt her own arm move against her will, mirroring its gestures. "Who are you?" Clara whispered. The reflection smiled. "I am what you will become." Before she could react, the mirror's surface rippled outward, and a cold, invisible force pulled her toward it. She clawed at the ground, screaming, as her reflection stepped out of the glass, perfectly solid and eerily calm. It stood over her, tilting its head with an almost curious expression, before walking away, leaving her to be swallowed by the mirror. Part 6. Trapped in a Glass. Clara awoke in a place of endless reflections. The world around her was a labyrinth of mirrors, each one showing her countless versions of herself. Some were younger, others older, and some were twisted into grotesque parodies. She screamed, but the sound was absorbed by the infinite glass. Through one mirror, she saw the main hall of Spiegelheim. Her reflection, no, her replacement, was speaking to Wilhelm, her voice eerily calm. "She's gone," it said, "but I'll stay. The Watcher is no longer a threat." Wilhelm nodded, unaware of the truth. Clara pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but no one could hear her. She realized with dawning horror that she had become part of the mirror, a prisoner of the Watcher's realm. Epilogue. Years passed, and Spiegelheim remained abandoned, its mirrors collecting dust. But sometimes, on moonless nights, travelers reported seeing figures moving within the glass. One such figure was a woman, her face twisted in anguish, pounding silently against the surface. Those who stayed too long claimed they could hear faint whispers, urging them to look closer, to touch the glass. Few dared to linger, but those who did often vanished, leaving nothing behind but their reflections in the mirrors.